Even in Reformed churches, there's debate whether a church should change its schedule to accommodate members that want to watch the Super Bowl. But doesn't that indicate a deeper problem? Welcome to The Conquering Truth. I'm Dan Horn.
I'm Roger Booton.
I'm Charles Churchill.
And I'm Joshua Horn.
There are churches that hold that for Super Bowl Sunday or for other things going on, that it's right to cancel Sunday services or to change them. And this isn't just about the Super Bowl. This happens for Christmas. This happens for Mother's Day. This happens for Father's Day, where people change the worship of God and the meeting of the church in order to accommodate what is secular activity outside. Now, obviously, this comes from an attack on the church, which we'll talk later. But let's start with the idea. So why would that be accepted? Why is that debatable?
So I think where a lot of that starts is people are saying, well, God created a day of rest. If we want to relax on that day, shouldn't we be able to relax the way that we want? I mean, God said it's a day of rest. And the problem with that is the focus then becomes on man. Even though, and we'll talk about it, the scripture says the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. But if you look at the original Sabbath, God created the earth. He rested on the seventh day. He created that as a picture looking forward. And the picture is about God. It's not about man. It's not about making man comfortable. It's about pointing to God and glorifying God. And if we say we can just relax, we can just do whatever we want on the Sabbath and not look really closely at what God's word says and at his instructions for how we should observe the Sabbath, then we're making it about us, and we're doing exactly, what the Pharisees did, and they instead of having it focus on God, they had it focus on, in their case, in the other direction of making it more stringent and saying, well, you can't be merciful on the Sabbath because it's about man.
And it's really about, yes, I mean, when Christ says that, in Mark, where he says that the Sabbath was made for man and not man for the Sabbath, he is correcting the Pharisees who have added all kinds of things to the law, right? Because at the time of the Babylonian captivity, they were taken off the land because they weren't keeping the Sabbath. So when they get brought back on the land, especially with Nehemiah, he goes, look, you got to stop buying and selling on the Sabbath. And so the Jews then shifted the other way and said, no, we're going to really keep the Sabbath. We don't want to be all killed, right? I mean, the majority of people were killed in Judea when they were taken into Babylonian captivity. So out of fear, they go, what can we do to escape the wrath of God? And Jesus goes, you're looking at the Sabbath wrong. It's to be a blessing, not a curse. But that doesn't mean that it's a blessing however you want it to be a blessing. It's a blessing the way God designed the Sabbath.
Roger, you kind of said we come at it from the wrong direction. And when you come at it from the wrong direction, you think about what it means to rest completely wrongly. You think about what the day is for. Because even though he says that the day is made, that Sabbath is made for man, he doesn't go, Sabbath is made for sinful man. He doesn't go, Sabbath is made for man to pursue his sin. He goes, Sabbath was made for man. And you have to ask, what does that mean? I mean, when God designed the Sabbath, when God created it, there was no sin in the world. God clearly desires the church to seek him on that day. And it's really easy when you start from that perspective to go, what are things that you can do righteously? I mean, like where he did attack the Pharisees, it was about being able to eat. It was literally, can you get food to eat on the Sabbath if you need to get it? And they said that's harvesting, and obviously it was reaching over, and they were walking. They reached over, they grabbed some grains, and they popped them in their mouth, and
they rubbed the chaff off. That was the work. They just popped it in the mouth, that would be fine, but they rubbed the chaff off.
And I do think, there are going to be people who go, they'll take that and they'll go, you guys are being just as nitpicky as the Pharisees. But when you look at this and you look at Scripture, that's just not true. There was a real focus. The disciples were literally walking with the Son of God, and they were going to go with him. They weren't going about their own pleasure. They weren't going to do whatever they wanted to do. They weren't going to satisfy the lusts of their flesh. And you go, oh, eating is the lust. No, I mean, you really have to be able to differentiate these things. And if you can't, this is how we got into where we are today, where you can do whatever you want on the Sabbath as long as it makes you happy.
I just want to address something you said. You said, not free to pursue your sin, which obviously we're not to do that. But there's, for example, working. That's not a sinful endeavor.
Right.
And so I just want to clarify that. We're not saying that everything necessarily is a sinful thing, but God says even things that are good, even things that he says that you must do, he doesn't
Right.
work, shouldn't eat. He's saying on this day, don't do that.
Right, and we've moved that. So my point, and what I was trying to say is, we've moved it so far that we move it to just do the things that you want to do that make you happy. Which is, like you said, it when you come at it from the wrong way, you distort it completely.
I mean, it's important to recognize when God says that the Sabbath was made for man, we need to remember what the Sabbath was primarily made for. It was a testimony to man of who God was. To say the Sabbath was made for man does not mean that you can do whatever you want. He created the Sabbath so that people would recognize that there is a rest in God, that he does the work. And so when they're saying you can't heal on the Sabbath day, or you have to starve, you have to fast on the feast day, which the Sabbath day was a feast day, they're saying God's not good, because the Sabbath is about declaring who God is. And so it was made for man so that man could understand this is what's required for salvation, right? That's Hebrews 4. And so what happens is, this is like when we think of a child-run household versus another household. If you have parents that are faithful and loving, their household is for their children. They are structuring it to raise and mature their children and to raise the next generation and send them out and have them be successful in the world, have them being a blessing to the culture. That doesn't mean they let them do whatever they want. The parent who says you can do whatever you want, they have not structured the household for the child. They've done exactly the opposite. They made the household miserable for the child by claiming that it's for the child, right? We all know what child-run households are like. They're horrible. They're horrible for the child. They're horrible for the parent. They're horrible for everybody. That is not how you make the household for the child. And it's the same idea with the Sabbath. The point is God structured the Sabbath. He told us what to do on the Sabbath. He gave us commandments for our good. It's not that man gets to say, therefore God has to let me do whatever I want. The Sabbath is not this child-run day. It's the day where the children of God listen to their father and do what their father tells them to do.
And one of the things that I think really stands out about the Sabbath, as you said that, is, one of our tendencies is we hear that something is for man, we think of it as for each and every individual man. And Sabbath is for man, for mankind, to show mankind what God is like. And one of the things about that is that the Sabbath is the most frequent touch point that the church has with the world. And I mean, if you were trying to demonstrate things to the world, it is weekly. Every week there is a day that the church is to set aside for the worship of God. And that is how the church, one of the largest ways that the church has an impact on the world. And so as we kind of talk about how, we're trying to frame what the Sabbath is for, but then we want to kind of look at and go, do we understand what happens when the church treats that day as if it's for our individual pleasure, as if it's for even our individual rest primarily, as opposed to show man what God is and who God is? It's we end up destroying one of the most powerful tools that God has given to the church to show the world what God is like.
And you look at when the man picks up sticks on the Sabbath day, in where is that? That's in Numbers, and they end up stoning him and killing him. Well, the Sabbath is made for man, and God is serious enough about it to say they need to die. That's not like contradictory. It's not like the Sabbath wasn't for man and then became for man after once Christ was born, because the new covenant hadn't been sealed yet. And so the Sabbath was always made for man, and so that's why God says protect the Sabbath. Keep it holy. It's not therefore you can do whatever you want. It's keep the Sabbath day holy, because it was made for man. It was to see the holiness of God and to see there is an escape from the sin that we have in the world. It's through God and his work.
Your analogy of the child-run household versus the authority-run household was very meaningful, because one of the things I remember thinking about as I grew up, there was a moment where you just kind of realize there's this phrase, so-and-so put him in his place. And I realized that what my father did for my family was he put us all in our place. And people go, oh, that's a horrible thing. It's like, no, we We all
I
had
do that every day at work. Sorry.
but we all had our place. We all had the things we were supposed to do. We all knew what we were supposed to do. We knew what was expected of us. And that is a very different thing from the child-run household where no one knows their place, where everyone is at the whims of tyrannical demands. And, you know what I mean? And it's actually a terror as opposed to an orderly place that you can actually have peace in.
And so if you look and you consider like Romans 8:28 versus Hebrews 12, in Romans 8:28 says, we know that all things work together for good to those who love God, to those who are the called according to his purpose. And in Hebrews 12, it says, and have you forgotten the exhortation which speaks to you as to sons? My son, do not despise the chastening of the Lord, nor to be discouraged when you are rebuked by him. For whom the Lord loves, he chastens and scourges every son whom he receives. If you endure chastening, God deals with you as with sons. For what son is there whom a father does not chasten? But if you are without chastening, of which all have become partakers, then you are illegitimate and not sons. And so what they're doing by saying that you can't do whatever you want, they're saying for God to be good to us, he can't scourge us, he can't constrain us, he can't punish us. And God says, no, for me to be good to you, I have to punish you. I have to put constraints on you. I have to stop your sin from destroying you. So the people who say the Sabbath is just to rest however I want, what they're really rejecting is the idea that God knows what's best for you and not you. And what's best for you is to actually focus on God. The problem that man has, among many, but one of the problems that men has is because we are carnal things constantly push at us. We're worried about money. We're worried about food. And I'm not even saying worrying in a sinful way. We have to pursue these things because they're necessary. And God says, I'm going to be good to you. I made the Sabbath for man, so you can spend a day focused on me, and I'll take care of those things. And when we turn around and say, no, I want to focus on my flesh, that's like the opposite of the purpose of the Sabbath. The purpose of the Sabbath is to say, I'm going to put away those worldly cares that everybody has, that are righteous cares. It's like you were saying, it's not sinful to want to work, but on the Sabbath it becomes sinful because God says, I've given you a day where you can just focus on spiritual things and you don't need to worry about physical things. And so the people who go, it's about, I want to watch the Super Bowl, so I need to be allowed to. Why I said this was a more serious issue is because the underlying issue is they don't want to focus on God. They think guys running around playing chasing a pigskin around a field, that somehow this is more important than seeing the living God. And we have to put that in that perspective. You know, even as I try to find words to be expressive enough of the contrast. Look, you're having these people that play this fake game of war to pretend, and it's all this pretend like it's serious and means something, and it means nothing, and it will disappear, and who cares? It matters to no one except for the people that are collecting money. And you have looking at the living God that transforms you. And people say, oh, I want the first rather than the second. That's idolatry.
And I think just you read the Hebrews passage, and it uses the word chastening in there quite a bit. And I know,
and scourging. I always like scourging.
but I do want to clarify, because I know you would agree with this, is that we're not saying that the Sabbath itself per se is chastening. Mm-hmm. We're saying is putting constraints on what you do at that day. It's not saying the Sabbath day is a punishment. Sabbath day is to be enjoyed, but it's to be enjoyed within the constraints of what you just described as focusing on the thing that is the most important thing, which is ultimately best for you, which is God.
And most of the verses in the Bible about the Sabbath are focused on working and resting. They're focused on buying and selling. But it is more than that. When you're dealing with sports and the Sabbath, people might argue, well, none of those verses apply because I am not working by going and playing, games on the Sabbath. I'm resting. But there are more scriptures that talk about it than just those ones about working. And of course, the most clear of these, I would say, is Isaiah 58, verses 11 through 14. The Lord will guide you continually and satisfy your soul in drought and strengthen your bones. You shall be like a watered garden and like a spring of water whose waters do not fail. Those from among you shall build the old waste places. You shall raise up the foundations of many generations, and you shall be called the repairer of the breach, the restorer of streets to dwell in. If you turn away your foot from the Sabbath, from doing your pleasure on my holy day, and call the Sabbath a delight, the holy day of the Lord honorable, and shall honor him, not doing your own ways, nor finding your own pleasure, nor speaking your own words. Then you shall delight yourself in the Lord, and I will cause you to ride on the high hills of the earth, and feed you with the heritage of Jacob your father. The mouth of the Lord has spoken. And when you look at this in context, the context makes it pretty clear that this is the new covenant. And you have, even in the verses right before where it really gets into the Sabbath, you have it talking about, the repair of the breach, the restore of streets to dwell in, where the things that were broken down are being built up. They're being restored in the new covenant with the spread of the gospel through the world. And then you have this promise of for those who are keeping the Sabbath. And the way it is defining keeping the Sabbath. It's not just resting. It's not getting maximum sleep that day, but it's honoring God. It's not doing your own ways, nor finding your own pleasure, nor speaking your own words, but instead delighting in God. And that's what the day is set apart for, that there's a greater purpose to it than just avoiding working.
And I think it's really important to catch the last part of that too. If you do this, if you delight yourself in the Lord on the Sabbath, then I will cause you to ride on the high hills of the earth. And what we have to understand is, put yourself in Satan's place. God says that if his church celebrates the Sabbath the way they should celebrate it, then he will be defeated. So if you're Satan, what do? You go, I should destroy the Sabbath. And the people that are arguing for that you should adjust it because people want to play sports or, pay people, whether it directly or indirectly, meaning watching ads is a way that you're paying them. You're the product, you're being sold. But that by doing that you're just doing your own pleasure. Well, this came, and it's called the continental view of the Sabbath. And the continental view of the Sabbath comes out in the mid-19th century. So what had happened in Scotland is that the guy who owned all the railroads in Scotland, he went, you know what? If we could run railroads 7 days a week rather than 6, that would increase our profit margin by 16%. So he wrote this story. He's the first one that comes up with the story that Knox, when he went to Geneva, and he shows up on a Sunday. All kinds of problems with the story. He shows up on a Sunday, and John Calvin is behind his house bowling. He's playing sports on the Sabbath. And this is the argument that is then used to try to undermine, and this becomes a stated doctrine, the continental view of the Sabbath, because it was the European continent, as opposed to the British view of the Sabbath, because this guy was trying to get Britain to adopt a view of the Sabbath that was not held in the continent, but he was making it up because, this is what you do if you're trying to undermine things, is you just lie. And so there was no evidence that this ever happened. Calvin's writings are very clear. He did not hold to that view. But this has been going on for a long time to go, no. Calvin believed that, of course, that the thing to do on Sunday afternoon was to go bowling because you need to rest.
This would be lawn bowling, right?
Yeah, lawn bowling.
Yeah, he was really against bowling alleys on Sunday.
Yeah, especially with the electric system. He was against electricity, too. Right. Oh, wait, he was hundreds of years before electricity.
Right. He was picking up a 7/10 split, yeah.
But the point is that this was an attack on the church that was done, and it continues to be. And we need to recognize, of course, this is what Satan would do. Of course, he'd say, wait, if people actually treat the Sabbath the way it should be treated, you mean there won't be legal sodomy in the United States? There won't be, transgenderism. There won't be millions of babies murdered, because God promised if the church kept the Sabbath the way he said to, that the church would ride on the high hills of the earth. We would defeat these things that are going on. So it's easy to say, well, it's just the Sabbath. But when you change the Sabbath to be about the pleasure of man, rather than the church being strengthened by looking towards God, the church becomes weak, it becomes ineffectual, and the society decays. And we've been watching that in the United States for 175 years.
And you can look even earlier to see this same exact issue being used as an attack on the church. So around 1610 in England, you have King James come to the throne, and one of the things that he does is issues what's called the Book of Sports. Because at that point, England, the Puritans would say they did a bad job keeping the Sabbath. But if we were to look at it today, Americans would be shocked at how much they kept the Sabbath. I mean, people, if you did do farm work on the Sabbath, you ran a pretty good risk of people coming after you. But what King James does is, he gets his name on the King James Bible, but he was not a righteous man. He was a pretty wicked man in a lot of ways. And when he produced
a wicked man who was very studied and educated in theology too. He understood these things.
Right. But when he comes out with this book of sports, that's a law that he is passing or promulgating. I'm not sure what it is technically, but what he is doing is he's instructing everyone that Sunday afternoon is for playing sports. Before that, I think they would sometimes do like military drill Sunday afternoon, but he's saying it's not just military, it's for having fun. So I want people dancing, I want people playing games, doing bowling, playing football. That's what I want on Sunday. Not American football, not even, but whatever ball game they were playing. That's what I want you to do. And so the Puritans were very opposed to that because they saw that this was an attack on, even specifically Puritans, because Puritans, maybe their, priest or a pastor in their parish wasn't Puritan, but maybe on Sunday afternoon they would gather and have another service, or they would discuss the sermon. But King James was saying, I don't want people doing that. I want you to be playing games on Sunday.
And King James was a very perverse man, right? The highest role in his kingdom was to be the not prince, but basically the prince of the bedchamber, because he was a renowned homosexual. And so he's doing all these perverse things, and he is attacking the church, but he was also very well educated by one of the leading Reformed scholars when he was growing up in Scotland. So he understood this, and he understood this is the good way to destroy the church. And he was a man who was very actively working his whole life to destroy the church.
He was kind of a modern-day Balaam in certain ways, right? I mean, look, going, how do I can't curse them directly, but I can curse them.
Well, he was also willing to curse them directly.
I mean, but not by the words of God. But I mean, he was.
And he's the head of the church.
I guess modern Reformed people would also like to hear that he hated tobacco. So, I mean, we don't mess with all that stuff. But there's a little factoid for all the pro-tobacco people.
And maybe one of the things to say is, even if you come to this and you're not a Sabbatarian, you should look at the fact that most people call it the Lord's Day. And there's a real problem with calling something the Lord's Day. I mean, if you call it that, if somebody called it your day, they call this as your day, and then they rearranged it to do things you didn't care about, you would question their sincerity. I mean, there's just a fundamental issue with it. So, I mean, even if you don't hold to the Sabbath view, and one of the reasons why we even did this episode and even mentioned it is the way we framed it is because we saw there was a poll in a Facebook group that was focusing on people who were Reformed, and a large percentage of them said, "Hey, building your Sunday around the Sabbath isn't a problem. Around the Super Bowl, sorry, building your Sunday around the Super Bowl, that's not a problem to restructure things to watch that, not an issue at all." And so it's gotten to a really, really bad state, not just in the church in general, but in the more conservative areas of the church. The Sabbath has been under attack for a long time.
And I think it's we'll talk about it a little bit, but I think it's worth saying we're not talking about things that started changing when King James, even though there were times when it lapsed. I mean, until, this century and even later into this, I mean, Dan and I are really old, but we both remember.
It was last century.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, that's right. Thank you. Yeah. I can't remember what century.
When you can't remember what century you're in, you're old.
But Dan
in the century that we
I'm
were
going to blow
born.
your mind. It was the last millennium.
Yeah. But we're old enough to remember when things actually changed to like, oh, wow, the stores are open on Sunday now. I mean, this is not something that was 150. I mean, obviously things were breaking down, but this wasn't something that was 300 years ago or 500 years ago. I mean, this is in our lifetime that in this country, places still observe this by law, by state law, observe the Sabbath.
15 years before I was born, North Carolina, I think pretty much every county had, businesses weren't allowed to be open except, one pharmacy could be open. And we had and they were even passed a statewide ban on businesses being open and things like that on the Sabbath.
So North Carolina is interesting because to go back a little bit, everybody kept the Sabbath. And then certain counties started to go, yeah, we don't need to keep the Sabbath. And then the state went, we are going to mandate the Sabbath for every county. So that's why there ends up being a state laws, because everybody just agreed that you keep the Sabbath. And then all of a sudden the state had to step in and go, there's counties that are saying that you don't have to keep the Sabbath, and that's not acceptable. And so it became a state law. That's why the state law was passed so late.
And it was overturned on kind of weird constitutional grounds. It wasn't even specifically about, like I said, it wasn't like, oh, you don't have the right to say this. It was the way it was worded. And there was the real point of it is there was an actual war going on within the church and within the culture over honoring God's day.
And I think it's really important to take a step back as we talk about these. It does say in Isaiah 58 that if you do these things, then I will cause you to ride on the high hills of the earth. He's saying, I will give you victory. I will make you visible. To ride on the high hills means that you're in a position of power. And so when you look at this and you go, the Sabbath is about fulfilling your lust, the lust of the flesh. You're fulfilling whatever you want. What you're doing is you're ignoring what the Sabbath was actually created for. Ezekiel 20, verse 12, it says, moreover, I also gave them my Sabbaths to be a sign between me and them, that they might know that I am the Lord who sanctifies them. What happens is, one of the reasons the church no longer walks on the high hills of the earth is when you start to say the Sabbath is about man, according to man's desires, rather than it's about man according to God's desires, right? Because that's the difference in how you translate or how you handle that verse about the Sabbath being made for man. Is what happens is you stop saying the purpose of the Sabbath day is to be sanctified. Well, if the church isn't sanctified, what happens to the church? Well, if there's salt that's good for nothing, what happens? You get trampled under the feet of men. Again, this is a great place for Satan to attack, because he attacks that and switches the Sabbath, and all of a sudden the maturity of the church dramatically drops. There's people who complain about how immature the church is and how unknowledgeable and how they don't. And part of it is if you lose the Sabbath, that is the natural thing to lose, because you stop looking towards the Lord for sanctification.
Right. God says, I sanctify the day and I sanctify you as part. There's just this complete connection between these things. And that's, like you said, we don't want to be set aside for what God set the church aside for. And, just if you're sitting there and you're bristling at this, just stop and genuinely think, why does God want you to go to a party and watch a game? Why would God want that? Why would that be God's desire for the day? You're like, it has nothing to do with the worship of God. And so you have to understand, you're starting with a completely different thought process about what this day is for. You really need to question yourself, why am I thinking this way?
And when you make the Sabbath about, well, this is for me to have a day of rest, where it's me resting and seeking my own pleasure, seeking my own desires, seeking what I want, don't think that seeking your flesh does not make you more carnal. The Sabbath was made to make you more spiritual, to look and say, it's God who sanctifies me. I need to think his thoughts. I need to speak his words. He's the one that will grow me. He's the one that will mature me. He's the one that will give me greater joy. And this is really important, because people are making an exchange of joy. People running around with pads on and smacking into each other and throwing a ball around, that they're going, oh, this is where I find joy. And God says, in my ways is joy everlasting. It's like, who do you really think has more joy? The football players that are making millions of dollars, or Jesus Christ, who walked in righteousness? It was Jesus Christ, in case you're wondering. And if you think you're going to find greater joy by watching the Super Bowl than by seeking the things of God, it means you don't know God. You don't know what God is doing. You're missing really fundamental understandings of the goodness of God, which is what's happened when we lost the Sabbath, is the church has forgotten how good God is. It says in Psalm 16, verse 11, you will show me the path of life. In your presence is fullness of joy. At your right hand are pleasures forevermore. This is what God is calling us to. Come into his presence. And the Super Bowl is going, no, we have the greater presence. Look at the Super Bowl, like the halftime show and all this stuff, it is like the pinnacle of worldliness. And people are going, oh, this is wonderful. And God is going, this is where the real joy is. This is where the real pleasure is.
I mean, when you see that at his right hand, I mean, that's a position of. I mean, what I keep thinking about is because we've lost this for so long, we've lost just people having purpose. We've lost people having meaning. You know what I mean? Like, there are parents who they don't have any greater thing for their children than their children to watch the Super Bowl game with them too. You know what I mean? And so there's
and the reason that they sell Super Bowl ads for so much is that is still the one unified thing in America, that the percentage of households that watch the Super Bowl is going up. There's nothing else that unifies America like the Super Bowl anymore. The president can go make a speech, nothing like what the Super Bowl hits. You know, it is the one event that's common among most of the culture in the United States. And so there's people who go, but I have to watch the Super Bowl. What they're really saying is I have to be part of the in crowd, part of the culture.
right.
And I can't be separate. And God says, be holy, come out from among them.
You will show me the path of life. In your presence is fullness of joy. At your right hand are pleasures forevermore. I mean, the picture there is like of a father calling his child out of childishness. You know what I mean? Out of immaturity. You know what I mean? Come, that the things that you think the world are for, that's not what they're for. The childish things that you think are what matter, they're not really what matters. Those don't have any lastingness to them. And come beside me and look at the world and look at the way I think about the world. Look at the work I want to do in the world. Look at the goodness I have. It's a father calling someone to maturity, or who was already there, but going, this is what life is about. This is what it's for. And we've just lost that idea. We've lost it to the point where we have this problem of making this distinction of why would God have a problem with this? I just want to spend some time with my family. You know what I mean? And God, and when you lose that, you even lose the ability to call your family to greater things.
And specifically what you do is you lose the purpose of the gospel. Central to the purpose of the gospel is us being sanctified. Ezekiel 36:22-23, therefore say to the house of Israel, thus says the Lord God, I do not do this for your sake, O house of Israel, but for my holy name's sake, which you have profaned among the nations wherever you went. And I will sanctify my great name, which has been profaned among the nations, which you have profaned in their midst. And the nations shall know that I am the Lord, says the Lord God, when I am hallowed in you before their eyes. And this is right before he says, I will remove your heart of stone and replace it with the heart of flesh. I will give you the Holy Spirit that will cause you to walk into my commandments and my statutes, and that you'll keep them. And so this is God saying, this is the purpose for the new covenant. This is the purpose. It's for his name to be glorified among the nations. It will be sanctified. And the way it will be sanctified is that it will be sanctified because we walk in holiness. The people who go, it doesn't matter. The reality is God says, this is how you're sanctified. You look towards me, you speak my words, you think my thoughts. I will set you up on the high hills of the earth. The people will be able to see you, and my name will be glorified, and the purpose for the new covenant will be fulfilled. This isn't like some secondary or some side thing. We want to make, just like the Sabbath day, it's about what I want. We want to make salvation, it's about my not going to hell. And God goes, it's about me sanctifying you so people see my greatness. They see how wonderful I am when I'm hallowed in you before their eyes. And so when you say the more important thing than speaking God's words is to watch people throw a ball around, it's undermining the gospel.
I think if you think about the Ten Commandments, and if you took a different commandment and said, okay, we're not to bear false witness. But what if I just lied? That doesn't really mean I have to tell the truth all the time.
Oh, people do.
right, that people do that. But if you take that and you say, well, if it's just a little white lie, or if it's a lie because I might get in big trouble if I told the truth, well, then that's okay because God wants good things for me. It just...
But I've had lots of people argue that.
Yeah.
I know.
Maybe murder.
But it's still but all of them work the same way. The temptation is for all of them. Because the person who goes, I would never murder anything, and then they scream at their spouse. Well, God says Christ said in the Sermon on the Mount, you've committed murder in your heart already. And so we want to go, oh no, I'm superficially keeping it. It's good enough. And Christ came and said, that's what you're doing with all the commandments, is you think that the pleasures and the good things of God and his paths of peace are there if you just kind of pretend to keep it. And you have to actually keep it.
You tithe in mint and cumin, but you don't keep the law.
And then you look and, a big fad that was in the 90s and the 2010s, during that 20-year period, was the seeker-sensitive movement. And it's always out there. And I'm not saying that it's not. But there was a big point where Rick Warren was pushing this really hard. And you have to understand, Rick Warren's view of the church is the application of the doctrine of the Sabbath that says on the Sabbath you can do whatever you want. He just applied it in a way that made him rich. He applied it in a way that caused the blasphemy of God. Because his church just lied about the nature of God. But just like Reformed people want to say, look, the Sabbath is about me fulfilling my pleasure. That's the seeker-sensitive movement. And so you see, this is kind of the picture. You see in the early 1900s, you see that the sports attack the Sabbath because they are the ones that came in. They were the first ones that could violate the Sabbath. And then you see, 70 years later, all of a sudden the church is adopting that same idea of let's undermine it, let's give people what they want, and we'll call that the church. Just like we called that keeping the Sabbath because you were relaxing by watching the football game. And instead of that, what you do is you get a man-centered church, which is an abomination in the sight of God. Because it's about the glory of God. That's the purpose of the church.
And it's for the same reason, because in the end, if what you say is on Sunday, we're going to come in and we're going to worship God, we're going to focus on God, then you push anything that gets in the way of that out of the way. And it doesn't mean you always do it perfectly, but your focus is, this is what we're going to do. But if you say that, hey, our highest calling isn't to put that focus on God, then why shouldn't salvation and who's in the church, why shouldn't that be the same way? That should be exactly the same way. Of course it should. You don't have to tell people who God actually is. You just tell them the part about God that they like. You tell them part about, and you have golf church, and you have, you have whatever you do whatever you need to do to get people to come to see God, because you're not pursuing God.
And it's about their pleasure. Just like on the Sabbath, it's about their pleasure. They want to watch the football game. Watch the football game. You don't have to work. God will give you the day off. He'll provide for you so that you can go watch the football game. You can go and do whatever pleases you, whatever's right in your own eyes. This is really, this response is people who just do not understand the holiness of God. I do think it's worth reading, and this is a summary of Rick Warren's position. I couldn't find any clear statement of Rick Warren's position, but AI is perfect. But this actually wasn't AI. This was somebody else that summarized his position. But I do think that this is a fairly accurate summary of his position. According to Mega Pastor Rick Warren, the following must occur in order to transform a traditionally styled church of any size into one that can boast dramatic growth. A contemporary styled seeker service aimed at drawing in the unchurched from the community must replace the traditional Sunday worship. So if you want to have a successful church, what you have to do is get the unbelievers to come. Well, that you want to give them something that pleases them. You keep the unbelievers in the church by going, of course you can watch the Super Bowl. That's a good way to keep unbelievers in the church. And so Rick Warren's doing the same thing. The dress must be casual because they have to get dressed up for church. That makes people uncomfortable. The music must be contemporary, replacing the organ with a band and using the choir as a backup for a soloist. You got to actually craft your entertainment. The message must be positive, dealing with self-esteem, interpersonal relationships, and motivation for success. Where's God in that? It doesn't have anything to do with it. Just like the Super Bowl doesn't have anything to do with God. This is a natural outworking of the same theology. The ministries of the church must be geared to meeting the needs and special interests of those who attend through small support groups that bring together people with shared needs or similar interests. A spirit of compromise must prevail, focused on what works, what is least offensive, and what is positive and uplifting. Christ said the gospel is a stumbling block. And they go, no. What you want to do is make it positive and uplifting. What you want to do is not say you have to focus on God because you don't want to have your football players who are idols. You want to actually focus on the living God. And they go, but that would drive people away. You know, people would skip church if you scheduled something at the same time as the Super Bowl. So let's just move the church service so it's not at the same time as the Super Bowl, because otherwise it will drive people away. The Reformed people, that a lot of the Reformed people would look at the seeker-sensitive movement and go, this is horrible. They need to understand that is what they're saying when they say it's fine to change your church service around the Super Bowl. It's fine to change your church service. If Christmas is that day, of course, we'll cancel church for Christmas. I know many churches that do that when Christmas is on a Sunday. Instead of saying, this is the Lord's Day, this is not Super Bowl Sunday.
With the Super Bowl, at least you have it it's not normally conflicting with the Sunday morning service. At least I don't follow the Super Bowl, but I don't think it does. But so
I think
least,
it just finished a few minutes ago, or I don't know if it's finished or not. But it was when we
usually
started
starts-
recording this. There were a few minutes left, which could take another hour.
This is counter programming to the Super Bowl.
It always starts between 6 and 7 Eastern time.
Right. So your evening service is probably going to conflict with that, but not your morning service. What I've seen, plenty of Reformed people talking about that it's not okay to be out of church every week during the summer for your travel sports team, for your kids. Like, that's a big issue, is that people will get in the program and then all summer they won't be in church a single time. So now they've taken it from just, the Sunday evening service that maybe we don't even always go to, we're going to skip that. Now they're saying Sunday is a day wholly devoted for a whole season to sports.
And I think that's a really good point, Joshua, that this, we're talking about sports, but it has trickled down into just sort of eroding away. I mean, when I was a kid, I played a lot of sports. I never had anything on Sunday. I mean, we didn't observe the Sabbath. We were Roman Catholic, but nobody scheduled sports on Sunday. And now, if your kid plays sports, unless they're in sort of just the, if they're competitive at all, there are things that, like you mentioned, the travel leagues, all those tournaments go all day Saturday and all day Sunday. And so not only are they out there doing it, but usually the families are gone. And so for part of the year, you don't see the family on Sundays because that's being prioritized over.
Yeah, and it's kind of like the same thing with the blue laws. Often they would start, you can open Sunday afternoon.
Yeah.
And then before long, it's all day Sunday.
And I do think, often where they started was sports. Because there's
like
people
you said,
where they started for the blue laws to erode, it started with sports. Because, when you think about how politics works, right? Politics is driven by money. For someone to put on a hard enough press to get politicians to change something fundamental like that, there has to be money involved. In most of these blue laws, they're changed because sports teams went, we have this expensive stadium. We need to use it 7 days. And so a lot of the blue laws were changed because of sports. It's not like sports is a secondary issue. The other things came after changing it for professional sports. Professional sports was usually the push.
And even more than just being able to use it 7 days. It was like there was this day. You only had 2 days where people weren't working.
Right.
You know what I mean? And they're like, of the 2 days where people aren't working, you're telling me we can't use one of them? We've got, it's like this is the day when people can actually come to stuff. If we get that, if we fix that. One of the biggest issues is that God uses the metaphor of war for what the church is to be doing. And the church acts like that is just not true. So there's this part of it when the world starts doing something, the church actually needs to look at it and go, this is an attack. And not that you look at the people and go, we have to destroy those people, because it's not flesh and blood. It's about principalities and powers. But you look at it and you go, this is about the worship of God. The world is attacking the worship of God. And if you don't have that mindset, you're going to treat it like it's a joke. You're going to treat it like it's a game. You're going to treat it like it doesn't matter. You can just move worship around to wherever you want. And God says, no, this is war. And so, it's ironic that sports is a metaphor for war, right? So you've got this, we want to go and do our war games, and we want to watch our war games on Sunday instead of actually being in the battle that Christ called the church to be in. If your church is, the fact that I say if your church is dealing with this, almost certainly your church has some intersection with this. And if you're not taking it seriously, if you're not going, we have to deal with this, you're not, then there's a fundamental problem. Your church doesn't treat worshiping God as a serious thing. So what I mean is that our church, where I would say we don't have the problem, but at the same time, I don't follow sports at all. I didn't know who was going to be in the Super Bowl until somebody told me. But
I still don't know. Beat you.
But
I didn't know until I looked to see if the game had ended yet just a few minutes ago, and
But
I
I-
still don't remember who it was.
I'm probably not doing as much as I should to keep my children's eyes fixated on what they should really be fixated on. That's how
Right.
pervasive it is. And that's what I mean I think anybody, because I would say we're probably a lot better. I don't know many churches that would be in a better position than we're in. And I just don't know how to measure it.
Right.
And so, but there are things that I should do because we're in a war. It is a war.
And when the command is not thinking your own thoughts, not speaking your own words, there's kind of a clue there that it's never going, until you're perfect,
Right.
you're never going to reach perfection, because not speaking your own words is pretty difficult, and not thinking your own thoughts is pretty difficult.
And that's kind of why I'm saying it that way, is we may not have the struggle specifically with the Super Bowl, but I even see issues with, like I said, even with sports and things like that, with me not protecting my children the way I should. But I know there's things that I spend time on the Sabbath pursuing my own desires. I have no question of that.
And again, I do think, this is reiterating what you just said, Charles, but, in Ephesians 6:12, it says, "For we do not wrestle against flesh and blood, but against principalities, against powers, against the rulers of the darkness of this age, against spiritual hosts of wickedness in the heavenly places." And I think we act like that enemy isn't active, that he's not actually. I mean, if you're wrestling, you don't just go, I get to make all the moves, and the other person I'm wrestling with, they just kind of lay there and they are only whatever I impose upon them. Instead, we're supposed to look like when you wrestle, the other person's also trying to win. And they are trying to win. So when I said beforehand, when Satan reads Isaiah 58, of course he'd go, how can I win? Well, the way I win is to not have the church ride on the high places of the earth. So maybe I should undermine the Sabbath. We need to be thinking that way, that Satan and the powers and principalities of the air are actively wrestling. They're actively fighting. They're actively trying to get the church to go into a path that will destroy the church and will make it weak so it can be defeated by Satan. This is what Satan is doing. And when you look at God saying, look, if you hold the Sabbath right, this is what I'll do. Everybody should be looking and saying, so where is the church in America? Are we riding on the high places of the earth? If anybody says yes, they should open their eyes. Because we're in Romans 1, right? That they did not like to retain God in their knowledge, so God turned them over to their perverse ways. That's where we are as a nation. We are not the church that's riding on the high places of the earth. We are the church that's being trampled under the feet of men. And we need to stand up and go. So how does God say spiritually we should fight this? Because we want to go, well, we'll get more Republicans elected. We'll, X, Y, and Z. Instead of going, well, how does God say that you have victory? He says, start by honoring me. Instead of the Super Bowl football players. And it's really important to recognize there's real idolatry there.
And put it into a real world example again. Let's say it was your wedding anniversary, and your wife was really big on, it was really important to her to do something special on your wedding anniversary. And let's say the Super Bowl was on Tuesday, and you said, and it was just really, and you go, well, no, we're not going to do that. Because I want to watch the Super Bowl. That's a silly. Now compare your relationship with your wife with your relationship to God. I mean,
she can just kill God.
Yeah. Now, some people would be like, I don't care. I want to watch the game. But I mean, if you really cared for your wife, that would really be a cruel thing to do.
Right. Most people, if they had to work that day, they would go, this is a bummer. I got scheduled to work on the Super Bowl. But what would they do? They'd go to work. But they go, I'm not going to go to church. So just all these things are measures of how important you think God is. And don't think that they aren't measures that you should look at in your own life and say, how important do I think God is? And if your answer is, of course, if I had to work, I have to work. I can't lose my job. But I can ignore God. I can rebel against God, but that doesn't mean anything. Do you actually have any idea who God is? Fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom.
And, people might be saying, I guess probably the anti-Sabbatarians have turned off by now, but if you're still there, they might be saying, well, when should we not prioritize God over everything? Are you saying we can never do anything that's not going to church, reading the Bible, praying? Well, no, because it says, God says, set apart one day in 7. He says in the New Testament, the Lord's day. That's the day he picked, the day he rose from the dead. That's the day that's set apart. So he's not saying never work. He's not saying only focus, don't focus on anything other than me, nothing of this world. There's a time for things of this world. But you have verses like Ezekiel 20:19 and 20. I am the Lord your God. Walk in my statutes. Keep my judgments and do them. Hallow my Sabbaths, and they will be a sign between me and you, that you may know that I am the Lord your God. And there that he's saying the Sabbath, keep the Sabbath. It's a sign for you that you are part of God's people. I mean, at least to some extent. It's not infallible that you go to church or a Christian, but it is a sign. And it's a sign to the world around you that these are Christians, that they are honoring God above everything else they do the other 6 days. And there's a point where this is true at a very practical level. Like, we live in the South, and a lot of people, you talk to them, they say they're Christians. But one way that separates the people who are serious from the people who aren't serious is the question, where do you go to church? Because people say, oh, I'm a Christian. Where do you go to church? Oh, well, I haven't really... I moved here 2 decades ago, but I haven't found the church yet. Well, that's a pretty big testimony that there's a very low chance that they're a Christian if they don't even have a church they go to. Because what are they doing Sunday morning? If it's not going to church, usually, then they're not taking the things of God seriously.
And this is the sign. And it's important to recognize that this is the covenantal sign. This is the covenantal sign that has been there from the beginning. Is those who are in covenant with God, those who have found the rest of God, they keep the Sabbath. Signs change, right? Before Abraham, there wasn't circumcision. Then after Abraham, there's circumcision. Then circumcision goes away, and the feasts were a sign, and there's all these signs. But the one sign that never changed from the beginning, because God embedded it in creation, was the sign that those who have faith in God, those who trust in God, they keep the Sabbath. This is the sign of the covenant. This is how you know that you know him. And it's not infallible. There's people who keep the Sabbath that aren't saved. But if you don't think you should keep the Sabbath, you might keep it wrongly, but if you don't even think you should keep the Sabbath at all, you don't have the sign of the covenant. Why do you think you're saved? Because it is the sign of the covenant. The sign that it is God's work that saved you. In Hebrews 4:3-9, it's important to recognize what he said here. For we who have believed do enter that rest, as he has said, so I swore in my wrath, they shall not enter my rest, although the works were finished from the foundation of the world. For he has spoken in a certain place of the seventh day in this way. And God rested on the seventh day from all his works. And again in this place, they shall not enter my rest. Since therefore it remains that some must enter it, and those to whom it was first preached did not enter because of disobedience. Again, he designates a certain day, saying in David, today, after such a long time, as it has been said, today, if you will hear his voice, do not harden your hearts. For if Joshua had given them rest, then he would not afterward have spoken of another day. There remains, therefore, a rest for the people of God. And the way this is translated, they're all rest. And there are two different Greek words, where it's one Greek word that means to rest. And then that last one, it's really, there remains, therefore, a Sabbath for the people of God. The Sabbath is the covenantal sign. And when the church fails to keep the Sabbath, it is failing to testify to the society around it that there is a day that you can enter the rest of God. When it loses the Sabbath, it says there is no rest of God. The only way that you can be saved is through works. Because when you look at the rest, when you keep the rest, you're testifying to the world that it is not your works that save. The works were finished from the foundation of the world. If you don't keep the Sabbath, you're saying you have to save yourself with your good works. And if you think, well, I can just go and watch a football game, or I can go to a comedy club, or I can do this or that, or I can do whatever pleases me, I can play sports, I can do whatever pleases me. In the end, you're saying it is not God who gave you rest. It's you who found your own rest. It's your works that made you righteous. And nobody's righteous by their own works. It has to be the finished work of Christ. And so God says, this is why I keep the Sabbath day. You keep the Sabbath day to testify that you can still be saved. When the church loses the Sabbath day, of course you can't have effective witness to people. Because you're saying you're saved by works if you don't keep the Sabbath day. It's this covenantal sign to say, it is not my works that saved. It was God's works that saved.
When we don't make it about the holiness of God, when we don't make it about God sanctifying his people, when we don't make it about our worship of God, we end up reducing it down to carnal things. You know, I mean, we make it about, are you pursuing money? And that becomes the thing. You know, if you're going to work and you're chasing money specifically, well, that's bad. But then we leave all the other things on the ground that are still our pleasure, that are still very carnal, that are still, but we exempt them from being things that we should turn away from and that we should turn towards God. And you can see how that battle works, because it is weird. It's almost like sports and leisure just sort of get exempted. They just sort of get of course you could do those things. Of course you can. How could those things be wrong? And I mean, you could make the argument that even during the week, those things shouldn't have anywhere near the place that they do in the world. You know what I mean? I think that would be a very easy argument to make, and we could talk about that probably at length.
The amount of money that's spent, the amount of time that's spent. But
it's really hard. It shouldn't even come into the Sabbath. And so there's this part of it where, because God, you were talking about how that God, during the week, God says, I've given you 6 days to do all your work. I've given you 6 days to glorify me through those things. On the seventh day, those things shouldn't be a part of it. And it's really, we've reduced and said the only thing that really matters on Sabbath is that you shouldn't be pursuing money.
And, there are so many examples in Scripture, like Nehemiah, where they're buying and selling on the Sabbath. And this is the example that's used often. And so people go, because that was the breaking on the Sabbath. Of course, the first example that I can think of was the man who was gathering sticks on the Sabbath, and it wasn't about buying and selling.
Right.
It was about work and about turning away from God and turning towards physical things. But I liked what you said before, is that if you eliminate the spiritual things, it simply becomes carnal. And money is basically a placeholder for carnality, right? I mean, It is the most obvious picture of carnality. So when a carnal people like the Israelites, when God goes to them and confronts them, it makes sense that he would use the sign of carnality, which is money, and go, you're buying and selling. And so then people limit it and go, well, it's just about buying and selling. But that was never the point. The point was he was talking to a carnal people, and they were not keeping it in a carnal way even. The people who are believers that actually think they have faith, we're supposed to understand spiritual things. And if you understand spiritual things, it's not just buying and selling. That's just the picture of a carnal keeping of the Sabbath. When you say, oh, I won't buy and sell. That's what the Pharisees did. And Christ said, your righteousness has to exceed the righteousness of the scribes and Pharisees. You have to understand spiritual things, or you will not inherit a spiritual kingdom. And so when people make it all about money, and they even miss the point that it's about a community testifying that God is God. So in Exodus 20, verses 9 and 10, 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the seventh day is the Sabbath of the Lord your God. And that you shall do no work, you nor your son, nor your daughter, nor your male servant, nor your female servant, nor your cattle. The point is that you're supposed to testify to God's mercy by causing the unbelievers to rest. And let's be serious, the cattle are unbelievers. Right? They don't have a renewed heart through the work of the Holy Spirit. No cow's ever been born again. And so God is saying, look, the point is, even unbelievers, it doesn't matter if they're a stranger. They get rest, because the point of the Sabbath is to testify that God's rest is good. And when your rest is to say, well, God's rest is bad, the rest on relaxing by watching the Super Bowl, that's good. You have completely undermined the purpose of the gospel. You've completely undermined the gospel message. And so then you have to come up with a new gospel, which is exactly what Rick Warren did. The gospel just goes, this makes you happy. So when you look at people like Rick Warren, Joel Osteen, Paula White, all these different people, they're all doing the same thing. And these churches that saying we should modify our church service to accommodate the Super Bowl, I don't care if you call yourself Reformed. You're focused on carnality. You're not focused on God. in The Death of Death and the Death of Christ by John Owen, there was an introduction written by J.I. Packer. And he goes, understand when the Arminians say the 5 points of Calvinism, this is what defines Calvinism. That's not what the Calvinists are supposed to say. That's what the Arminians, that was the argument that was used to defeat the Arminians. What the Calvinists say is God is the center of all things. When you say the Super Bowl is the center of all things, that's not Reformed. That's not Calvinistic. That is purely carnal. And that's far more Arminian, regardless of what you say your soteriology is. That's Arminian because it's a man-centered gospel rather than a God-centered gospel. Arminianism is just one aspect, one manifestation of a man-centered gospel. Another manifestation is I'll use the Sabbath to please myself however I want. That's another manifestation of a man-centered gospel. There's either a God-centered gospel or a man-centered gospel. Either the gospel is for the glory of God or it's the glory of man. It's either for the righteousness of God to be revealed or for man to boast. And if you say, Sabbath, of course we should change the worship of God so that we can watch the Super Bowl. Nobody can look at that and actually go, oh, yeah, that's a God-centered gospel. That's not. That's a man-centered gospel, just like Arminianism.
You're no different than the Israelites. Moses goes up on the mountain and then they rise up to play. You know what I mean? You're just
Might be probably more constrained, but,
right.
But
it's
the
the same
underlying
fundamental
issue
thing.
is the same.
And the underlying issue is either not looking to see and understand what God says in his word or not, or just deciding to ignore it. I mean, it can happen both ways.
Right.
But it's just the idea of, because all these things we're saying, we're not saying, oh, we don't like this, so this is what you should do. And we're really, I think, trying very hard not to do what the Pharisees did and add additional things on. We're saying, what does God's word say? We should obey what God's word says. And so if you're not doing that, you're either ignoring it or you're just deciding I'm going, either you're not pursuing it or you're just saying, oh, I'm just going to ignore it on this thing because it kind of cramps my style a little bit.
And I do think, there's a lot of people out there, and it's worth considering the history a little bit, because I think there's a lot of people out there that are going, well, it's just sports. I mean, I wouldn't do lots of other things, but it's sports. That's the only time I can watch those sports. Instead of going, sports is the way it was overthrown. This isn't like a secondary thing. This is, all the states pretty much had blue laws, or at least some idea of a blue law is you have to be closed on the Sabbath day. And they had some form of it. So even as late as 1917, there were two baseball managers that organized professional games on the Sabbath. And they were arrested because they went, this is illegal. And by 1920, they started to play some baseball games on the Sabbath. That's when football starts on the Sabbath. In the NFL, when they start, that's one of the first things they do. And they do the Sabbath, and you can look from a pragmatic viewpoint and go, okay, they're doing the Sabbath because they're going, nobody else is doing anything that day, so it's nice and open.
Right. I mean, Connie Mack, who managed the Philadelphia Athletics, his argument was, I need to play on this Sunday to make my payroll.
Right.
So they make these claims that are, we won't survive unless we can do this.
Right, and there was a lot of car manufacturers that were saying, yeah, you have to have these sports teams because they were, again, the lobbyists were pushing this. There was money in it to overturn the blue law because they basically said that the cars that get advertised at the football games, those are the cars that sell on Monday. So they have at the home, they can watch and they can find out this is the car I need, and then they run out to buy it.
NASCAR had
Really a really weak argument.
But it's the argument that explains why there's so much money behind it.
Yeah.
Because there was real money, and the church didn't rise up and say, you're worried about money, you should fear God. Instead, the people with money were talking to the politicians, and the politicians nodded and went along because the church didn't talk about it. But the issue is that after that, by 1930, most states had allowed professional sports. They usually, even in the 70s, they were not allowing a lot of other things to happen on the Sabbath. But professional sports, 40 years it was before it starts to affect everything else. And this is the pattern. It was sports that drove it. And now people are going, yeah, I wouldn't go out to eat on the Sabbath, but I'm not buying and selling. I can sit and watch the Super Bowl. I'm not buying and selling. And they forget this is what was used to break this church's position that the Sabbath is about the worship of God.
And it was interesting. I was doing a little research around this, and the groups that were, to their credit, they were fighting to stop it. But a lot of their arguments were, well, these are unseemly things, or these are bad things. Instead of, and it sort of at the end was, and also, it's God says you should honor the Sabbath.
Right.
And so I think even if you probably went back and looked in greater detail, I think the failure that maybe a lot of times well-intentioned believers are making is they make the argument, but instead of, they say, well, that's really bad for you, you shouldn't do it. Instead of saying, well, this is what God says, we should do what God says.
Instead of saying, God says he'll judge for this. Remember Judah. Judah had almost everybody die, and then they took into Babylonian captivity because they wouldn't keep the Sabbath. Remember, God takes this seriously. But especially because then the church had, Arminianism was the prevalent view in the church by the time this happens. And so one thing, like you were talking about in a Reformed group, that it was posted and like 60% of the people were for changing the church service for the Super Bowl. When you think about that, right, that is the Arminian position. So because when it was saying that it's God and this is God's day, it's the Lord's day, it's for us to respect the Lord, that the professional teams couldn't do that. It's when it started to become man-centered religion. That's when you open the gate so that you can put pressure on the politicians to change it. God says, keep my Sabbath, you will ride on the high hills of the earth. When they stopped riding on the high hills of the earth because they went, well, it's really about man, then the church loses its influence. The church loses its testimony. The church, because its testimony is supposed to be, it's God who sanctifies us. It's God who saves us. And the Sabbath is the means of God's sanctification of his body. And you eliminate that, and why do you think that you're going to have any influence?
Right. We've even lost what the word testimony means. The church lost its testimony because the church testified to the fact that God's worship didn't matter. There was something more important than that. That's what they said through their testimony. Is there is something more important. When that comes along, this must give way.
And to be fair, they went not the church service, just the worship of God the rest of the time.
Right.
The church service, that's still sacrosanct. You still need to go to church. But that's not biblical. It's a day. It's not an hour.
And you talked about the testimony, Charles. I mean, in the midst of all that, in the midst of the changes, you had individual things. So the famous movie Chariots of Fire is about Eric Liddell. He was a British runner, and his event was the 100-meter, which he was very good at. And that race was on Sunday. And he said, I can't do it. And he received a lot of backlash for it, being unpatriotic. He ran in the 400-meter and won a gold medal, which was not his event. I mean, so you have something on the world stage of something like that happening, which you would have hoped would be an example for people to say, hey, we really should observe the Sabbath. This guy he'd worked for this for a long time, and he said, no, I'm not going to do it.
Right.
He was the Chick-fil-A of his era.
But then it's like, oh, it's so great that Chick-fil-A is, they give their employees the day off, so I'm going to go to Bojangles on Sunday.
Right. I mean, it is funny how much Christian we love Chick-fil-A so great. I wish they were open on Sunday, but I'm so proud of them for not being open on Sunday. Now where are we going to eat? Where will we go? Again, because we say it would be bad for them to make their employees work, but it's not bad for us to go and make other people work. I mean, it just
and that's even when you start to make it a man-centered gospel, even that man-centered gospel is going to degrade to a me-centered gospel. And so the people who are going man-centered gospel, then and understand, like you said, Reformed people are saying this, which just makes no sense whatsoever, because it's completely contrary to true Reformed theology. But if you're going to make it man-centered and say the Sabbath is man, meaning it's for man to seek his own pleasure, in the end it will be, well, I'll get mine, and I'll seek my own pleasure, and it doesn't matter if it causes other people to violate the Sabbath. As opposed to what the Sabbath law says in Exodus 20 is, you have to make your servant not work. This is your responsibility. And so you go to Bojangles and you go, they're not my servant. Well, what did they do? They gave you the food. They served you. You know that they're serving you. They are your servant. They may not be your permanent servant, but they're your servant.
You paid them, yeah.
You paid them. And you made them work. And then you wonder why the church has no testimony. One of the busiest times is, especially for buffets in the South, one of the busiest times is, Sunday afternoon, right after church service. All the restaurants are really crowded because all the people go to church and then they go out to eat and they go, well, why wouldn't I? I mean, somebody that in a church that I went to a while ago that they owned a restaurant and they went, I just can't go to church anymore. We have to get the buffet set up. And this is really what happens. And this really undermines the testimony of the church, because everybody can then look at the church and go, the church is more worried about their belly than they're about God. And they have no argument against that, because the reality is they are more worried about their belly than they're about God.
Would it help if I told you we were also going to tip poorly?
You don't encourage people to work on Sunday.
And our children will be unruly and make a mess, and we won't clean it up.
Well, the tip rudely, that's just Christians, so or poorly. Unfortunately, there is a reputation there too, because when you're doing a seeker-sensitive church, when you're doing an Arminian thing, it's all about you, and of course that manifests itself in all kinds of different ways. When you make it carnal, of course it's going to be carnal, and so I mean Christians do have a reputation for being terrible tippers, quote unquote Christians. And so, the sports was the lever in, because there was money behind it, because people wanted it, people liked it. It meant that they didn't have to go read the boring Bible anymore. They didn't have to talk to their kids anymore. Instead, they could do something that they could just check out with. But that compromise that comes in, it connects. It connects to the seeker-sensitive movement. It connects to these flaws that are currently in the church. We shouldn't pretend like this wasn't a wedge issue that was successfully used to make the church ineffectual in America. The Sabbath was made for man, and not man for the Sabbath, which doesn't mean that you can do what you think is right. Those who have the humility to go, God is wise and I'm a fool, they're the ones that go, how does God want me to, let me try that again. The Bible says that the Sabbath was made for man and not man for the Sabbath. Those who then turn around and go, well, we can do what we want. What they're acting like is that God doesn't get to tell them what is good and what is pleasant and what is true. We so deceive ourselves that we're seeking after pleasures and worldly things. And God says, look, in my presence is everlasting joy. We've sold our birthright for a mess of pottage. Thanks for joining us.
This has been The Conquering Truth, a project of Reformation Baptist Church. If you found this helpful, you can visit us online at theconqueringtruth.com and subscribe here or in your favorite podcast app. Thanks for watching.